Hi, and welcome to Hope Church Online. My name's Jason. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope. And just thank you so much for watching this today or listening to this, whether you're gathered with your community group or you're listening to this via podcast on your morning commute. Thank you so much for spending these few moments with us as we are looking to walk the way of Jesus in our everyday life. Today, we are in week 7 of our 9-week vision series called On Earth as in Heaven. And as a recap, here is our vision statement. We exist to bring hope to our community by practicing the way of Jesus until it is in Nashville as it is in heaven. Now, these next 3 weeks, weeks 7 through 9, we are going to be focusing on what I would call the appendix of the vision series. The first 6 weeks, we kind of did a head-first dive into unpacking each segment of the vision series. But now we're going to kind of focus on all the stuff that we wanted to say, but either didn't have time or space for in the first 6 weeks. So these last 3 weeks are attached to the vision series, but they're kind of an addendum or an appendix to it. And we're going to be answering the big question of how are we formed? If you remember back earlier in the series, we talked about the concept of spiritual formation, specifically in the teaching on being with Jesus and becoming like Jesus. And if you don't remember what that is, or you haven't had a chance to watch that, let me encourage you, go back and watch that. We unpack Jesus' teaching on John 15, and where he talks about how he is the vine and we are the branches. And the idea behind what Jesus is getting at there is that the branches abide, or they make their home in the vine, but the goal was to produce fruit, right? Spiritual fruit. Jesus even said that a branch that produces fruit will be pruned so it can bear more fruit. But if it does not produce fruit, then it gets cut off and thrown into the fire. Well, we don't want that, right? We don't want to be cut off and thrown into the fire. So the question is, well, how do we grow fruit? How can we maximize this in our lives? How are we formed? If you grew up in the church, this was called the process of sanctification. And I think that there's a few things here that Jesus wants to show us in this text that helps us understand how this process happens. But to do that, we got to kind of dive back into the world of agriculture. Now, if you go to a vineyard, be it a grape vineyard, a wine vineyard, an olive vineyard, or whatever the case may be, you're going to notice a few things right out of the gate. One, you're going to notice, hopefully, a vine, right? A vine that's kind of coming up out of the ground. It's got branches, and depending on the season, it's got fruit. But the second thing you're going to notice is something called a trellis. Now, the clinical definition of a trellis is a structure of intersecting or interwoven pieces of wood that are used to support and guide the growth of climbing plants, right? You may have seen it kind of crisscross like this. Where I grew up in the deep south, like we used the trellis to wrap around the front porch to hide the lawnmower that we stored underneath there, right? But in a vineyard, they are used to help guide the growth of the plant. Now, chances are you may not have heard the word trellis or even use it on a regular basis, but it's something that you have seen if you've ever been to Disney World, right? When you walk into the gates of Disney World, they have all of these characters kind of lined across the front, and they are in the shape of like a Disney character, like Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, but they're made out of a bush. Now, I'm going to tell you something that Disney doesn't want you to know. There is no such thing as a Minnie Mouse shrub. They don't exist. Right, you can't go down to the garden department of Home Depot or Lowe's and buy a Donald Duck bush. They just don't exist. Right, to create that shape, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, but it also takes this underwiring of a trellis that helps to form the outline of that shape so that the bush or the vine or the shrub or whatever can grow along with that shape to create that character. And then the person comes along and snips off the parts that kind of stick out that don't belong. Well, for us, I think that if we're going to bring that, let me just kind of bring that into our teaching over the next few weeks. You and I do not naturally grow in the way of Jesus. Right? Our natural bent is actually away from the teachings or the life of Jesus and more toward the things of self, what Richard Rohr calls the ego or the false self. This is what Paul talks about in the New Testament, where he talks about the things of the flesh. right? This is our natural tendency, that the way that we would sort of normally drift if left to our own devices. I mean, Jesus himself says in Matthew chapter 7 that this way of life and peace and joy, what we would call the way of Jesus, is not something that we do on our own. In fact, we kind of, if left to our own ways, we kind of drift more toward what he calls the way of destruction, which is broad and wide, and it ultimately leads to death. When the conversation, or the process rather, of spiritual formation, what I want to propose is this, that because of this natural tendency away from the life and the way and the teachings of Jesus toward our own destruction, we have to have a trellis of sorts that is used to mold us and to shape us into the image of our Rabbi Jesus. Now, these things are not the vine or the branches themselves, but they are responsible for the shape that we take. And I would even say that by not using them, we are maybe forming a different shape or a different path. And I think that in the life of a follower of Jesus, there's really two pieces of wood, if you will, that form the trellis for us. There's a lot of things that you could say here, but I think there's two main ones. The first is the role of God in our lives, and the second is the role of relationships in our lives. Today, we're going to talk about the role of God. Next week, we're going to talk about the role of relationships, and make sure that you come back because both of these are incredibly important. So for today, I want to kind of dive deep into Philippians chapter 2 to look at what this first part of the trellis looks like as God works in our lives to do something very specific to mold us and shape us into the image of Jesus, our Rabbi. Now, as you're turning to Philippians chapter 2, hopefully you've got it open in front of you. If you don't, you can push pause here and go get a Bible, or you can look it up, Google it, whatever the case may be. I use the NRSV, the Newly Revised Standard Version. There's a lot of great translations out there. But let me just encourage you to have this open in front of you so you can kind of follow along. But as you're turning there, here's a little bit of the history of what's going on. Paul's writing this letter to a group of followers of Jesus in the city or the region of Philippi. And Philippi was under Roman rule. And Rome during this time was one of the largest empires that had ever been and ever has been in existence in the history of the world. And a large part of the reason they were able to do that is because of what was called the Pax Romana. Now, the Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome, was this idea that the local army or the local military could squash anything that they thought would have been an attempted insurrection. So while there was a great deal of peace across the Roman Empire, there was also a great deal of oppression and injustice as the Roman government or the Roman military sought to make sure that control was maintained at all costs. Well, what Paul's doing here is he's writing to a group of people that basically did not fit the bill whatsoever, right? These guys were poor Jews, which means they were not Romans, who followed the way of Jesus, who they said was God and not Caesar, right? And they were living in modern day Greece. Now, here's what we have in Romans chapter 2, starting in verse 12. Read this with me. Paul says, "Therefore, my beloved, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure." Now, there's a lot happening in this passage, and I'm not going to be able to tackle all of it, but I do want to kind of dive deep into a few things regarding verses 12 and verses 13. First off, look at what Paul says out of the gate. He says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Now, that phrase work out is the Greek word katergazomai, which literally means to accomplish. Right? What Paul is saying is this: you are to see this thing through until the very end. There's this common belief, and I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but it's this common belief in the church or about the church that if you just kind of try a little bit, or, you kind of do a few things here or there, that maybe one day you'll be perfect, right? Here's the reality. You're not. Like, this is something that's going to take you the rest of your life. You're going to have to work at this 24/7, 365 until basically you get to the other side of heaven. I mean, it's a lifelong process. So then what are we supposed to commit? Like, what are we committing the rest of our lives to as followers of Jesus? Paul says it's our salvation, right? It's this idea of you cannot just wake up and be Mother Teresa 2.0. You've got, this takes effort. It takes work. And what he says right out of the gate is it is an active thing. You are to work this out. All right. You are to actively pursuing your own rescue in all things. Spiritually, yes, but also emotionally, mentally, relationally, politically, financially. I mean, you can just kind of go on and on and on. I love the way Eugene Peterson puts it in the Message. He says that we are to be energetic in our life of salvation. We've got to commit to this 100%, 24/7 until the day we die. Like, don't be stagnant. Keep going. But then he says too that this is not just a general thing. This is something that is very personal, right? He says, work out your own salvation. Parents, you cannot work out the salvation of your kids. No matter how much you want that, no matter how much you try, you cannot do this. Spouses, husbands, you can't work out the salvation of your wife. Like, you can't get her to do like what you want her to do or what you think she should do, right? You have to start with yourself. Coworkers, your boss, you can't do this for him. You have to do it in yourself. Some of us are enslaved to this idea that you see other people around you as maybe less than, or maybe as a tool or a utility to use to sort of maybe advance your own social imaginary, right? Or to advance your own mental progress or even your career or occupational progress, right? And so what happens is you end up looking at other people either as a tool or as a project, as something to fix or something to use. What's interesting about that is that one, it's demonic. I mean, that type of thought process is evil and it's oppressive because it's not at all the way that God unpacked his love for us in the way that basically the Bible or Jesus really in general talks about how we are to view other people, right? These are people, the people we're surrounded by are people who are loved and made in the image of God. And we are to show that type of love for them and that respect for them as well. But the second thing is that some of us are enslaved to our own mental or emotional demons that we constantly hear voices of criticism and critique regarding our body image, our mental health, our social status. Like, so many times we think we're supposed to be further along than we really are. Like, that's my problem. So many times I'm like, oh my gosh, I should already be at this stage in my life and my spiritual journey or my mental or emotional journey. I'm just not there. So I just get frustrated and I hear these voices of failure and critique constantly in my life. But here's the thing, like, that is just as evil and oppressive as the first one, because it's not based on truth of what God has said about you and what he said about me, and that we are loved and that we are made in his image. What Paul's getting at here is that sometimes we can look at the most obvious things and say those are oppressive in nature, right? Things like social inequality and racial inequality and go, those are wrong, right? Stereotypes and go like prejudice and bigotry, like those are wrong. But Paul is what he's getting at here is that there is a far more dangerous, far more intimate bondage that we are all sort of enslaved to, right? What Paul was saying to them was that to the Philippians, their bondage really, first and foremost, wasn't to the Romans. It was to their own relational, social, political, and religious ideologies or philosophies that were keeping them from moving forward and progressing in the way of Jesus. Right? Jesus himself, in talking about political and social power, said it this way. He basically says, well, what does it profit if you gain the whole world but you lose your soul? Some of us are trying to gain the world, maybe trying to gain a social foothold or maybe a mental foothold or an emotional or career foothold, but at what expense? What Paul's saying is that we have to work hard to break these things in our lives that we are so easily entangled with. We are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Now, if you've read other writings that Paul has had, you can see right out of the gate, this begins to create somewhat of a problem for us. Because if you think back to Ephesians, the book of Ephesians that Paul wrote there in Ephesians chapter 2, he said that grace is not something, salvation is not something you can work out. Salvation is actually something that you can't earn itself at all, right? You are saved by grace through faith, not by works, right? It's not your merit. It's not your doing. It's not your trying. None of those things can give grace to you or salvation to you. So how do we reconcile these two things? Well, let me just kind of say that one, I really don't like English. One, I'm not very good at it most days, but I think that the English in this kind of particular case, it just kind of falls short. And here's what I mean. In Ephesians chapter 2, the word that Paul's using there, where he says, "For by grace you have been saved," is the word sozo. And it's a word that basically designates the final outcome of an event, right? What Paul's talking about there is that your final outcome, right? The final outcome of your healing, of your restoration, of your rescue is something you cannot earn. You can't do anything to merit it or to win God's favor for you in that because of what you've done, right? It's done. What Jesus did for you is enough. But that's not the same word he uses here in Philippians 2. Rather than using the word sozo, he actually uses the word soteria. And here's the difference. Where sozo is kind of like a final outcome, soteria, while it can be translated salvation, is more about the process of being healed than it is about the final outcome. Basically, what Paul's getting at is this. What Jesus accomplished was the possibility of a final state of salvation or healing. But the process by which that possibility is realized is largely up to the way in which you work it out or allow this process of spiritual formation to take place in your life. Now, I know that's thoroughly confusing, but Paul, fortunately for us, keeps going. And so let me kind of unpack this kind of how this process works in you and in me on a daily basis. Let's look at verse 13 once again. Paul says this, "For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you to both will and work for his good pleasure." Now, there's two words here that are crucial to understanding the means by which God brings about this process of change on the individual level, right? The first word is the word work. Now, if you have the New King James Version or the KJV, it may say to do, right? To work for his good pleasure. And it's actually the Greek word energeo, which is where we get our word energy from. And it literally means power, right? It is the ability or the capacity to do what is right. Now, we all know you have to have power in order to have change, right? If you don't have power, then you're impotent. You will never see change come about in your life or in anybody else's life for that matter. But if you have too much power, or if you have maybe wrongly oriented power, then really all you have is a bully, right? Or a tyrant. You've got somebody who's got basically their agenda, their way or the highway, right? What they say goes, right? You do what they say, not as they do. Like this kind of really ugly, just gross type of abuse of power. That's not the type of power that Paul's talking about here. He's talking about something that scholars have called a compassionate power. Now, here's the difference between tyranny and compassion, or tyrannical power and compassionate power. Tyrannical power says that they are seeking to create change. It's power to create change for the sake of one's own self or their own agenda. But compassionate power is the power to create change for the sake of others. Right? Here's the catch. When you have power and you refuse to exercise that power for the sake of other people, sometimes it's standing up for injustice. Sometimes it's simply not saying the thing that you really want to say and you feel like the other person really needs to hear, but you know it's really not done in a spirit of love. This is something I'm very guilty of, by the way, right? That is tyrannical power. Compassionate power says, you know what? I'm going to extend forgiveness and grace to you, even though you're not asking for it. Even though you don't deserve it, in my opinion. And even though I don't think that this is going to fix anything, I'm going to offer you grace and forgiveness because I have the power and the capacity and the ability to do that. That's the difference between tyranny and compassion, or tyrannical power and compassionate power. Right now, in our postmodern day and age, there is a philosophy of political and social change that's being preached, and it's called critical theory. And the idea behind critical theory is that if we pass certain laws or we bring about social reform, then we will see oppressed people treated with equity. And the hope is that it would lead to permanent and lasting change. Now, there are things about critical theory that I affirm and I agree with and I love. But there are also things that I don't agree with, that maybe I don't think that they go quite far enough in. But the reality is that one of the biggest issues with critical theory is that the idea of passing laws or creating social reform will not bring about lasting and permanent change, because it can't. Now, I'm all for passing laws and trying to create social reform. Like, I'm 100% in line with that and would agree with that. I mean, the Bible talks regularly about how we are to stand up for those who are oppressed and to fight for justice for those who are treated unjustly. Jordan B. Peterson says this. He says that the purpose of life is finding the largest burden that you can bear and bearing it. And I would say, yes, like, I totally agree with that. But I don't think that those things are enough, because ultimately they don't have the power to dismantle the oppressive systems in our culture, much less the oppressive systems that we have in our lives intimately within our souls. Right? The power that Paul's talking about here is a power of compassion, that we can not just see things change, but we can actually affect real, lasting, permanent change when we act out of compassion and seeing that come to fruition in the lives of others and in the culture around us. And it happens through the second word in this passage, which is through the will. Now, the Greek word for will here is the word thelo. And there's a lot of different ways to translate this. My favorite, and I think that's the one that's probably the most accurate, is the word passion. Right? It's the ability to want what is right, not just to do it, but to actually desire it. And this is where I think that a lot of times we maybe misstep. Right? Creating laws, trying to work for social reform, those are all good things. But ultimately, they don't deal with the core issue, which is the heart. Right? I see this in my kids all the time. Like, I want them to pick up their clothes. Like, I tell them, hey, like, you need to get your clothes off the floor or there's going to be consequences. And when I kind of enforce those consequences, they do it. But the next day, they're back on the floor again. Why? Because I can't change their desire to pick up their dirty underwear off the floor. I just can't. Right? You and I do this too. Right? There are laws about speeding. But ultimately, we do what we want to do, which is why we drive 5, 10, or maybe more miles over the speed limit. Right? You can legislate behavior modification, but you cannot legislate a change of heart. And that's the core issue here. Right? Dallas Willard, I love what he says about this. He says that when we try to legislate change, what we are trying to do is we are trying to impose the outer forms of our existence, right? This behavioral structure upon people who come under our power. You can see this, probably the most obvious way is in the political realm, right? The one side says about the other side, like, we want to do this thing, we want to bring this reform, we want to create this kind of change. But in doing so, everybody who is against us, if you're not for us, you're against us. And if you're against us, you're, a heretic or whatever kind of name they come up with, right? And they both sides do it, by the way, right? And the other thing we see this in social realms, right? Right now, there's this huge thing that's happening called cancel culture. Maybe you've heard of it, where if somebody doesn't agree with somebody else's particular political affiliation or like convictions or whatever, then they call for them to be canceled, right? We just want to cancel them out, right? Basically wipe them off the planet. But we also see this, honestly, in the religious world. Right? So many churches throughout history have said, if you don't affirm these things, if you don't live by these rules, if you don't do this and do that, or don't do this, and then you can't be one of us, you can't even hang out with us. And we sort of create this culture of standoffishness where you are either going to be a part of our rules and our laws and our legislation, or you're not. Willard, he keeps going. He says that the revolution of Jesus, however, right, is a revolution of character. right? It's not a revolution of laws or social reform or whatever, religious systems. It is a revolution of character, which proceeds by changing people from the inside through ongoing personal relationship to God in Christ and to one another. It is one that changes their ideas, their beliefs, their feelings, and habits of choice, as well as their bodily tendencies and social relations. It penetrates to the deepest layers of their soul. We all have passions, right? Things that we would like to see happen, not just socially or politically, but personally, intimately, emotionally. But very few of us feel like we have the ability to do or to want the right things rightly. When I was a kid growing up, I was taught that my passions, specifically for girls, was too strong, right? And that was kind of the mantra coming from the churches that I grew up in. It's you're too strongly wired this way, and so you need to sign this commitment card, committing to a life of purity before you get married. You need to have this ring, and there's this whole ceremony, and I get the sentiment behind it, and I applaud the people and the motives behind what they're trying to do. However, what it did in me was it didn't really fix anything. If anything, it made me want to do what I shouldn't have been doing even more, right? C.S. Lewis, he says it this way. He says the reason why, he says, is it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. I think growing up, my issue wasn't that my passions for the opposite sex were too strong. I think that they were just wrongly oriented. They were misaligned or misplaced. And our role or our job as followers and apprentices of Jesus is not to suppress our desires, but to leave the slums of our shallow wants and accept Jesus' invitation to take a vacation at the sea of joy and rightly oriented desires. James K. Smith, who's one of my most favorite authors, says it this way. He says, Jesus' command to follow him is a command to align our loves and longings with his. To want what God wants, to desire what God desires, to hunger and thirst after God and crave a world where he is all in all. A vision encapsulated by the shorthand, the kingdom of God. Now that sounds amazing, right? To have rightly oriented passions and rightly oriented power. But if you're anything like me, that is not my reality, right? I feel like I am more like what Paul talks about in the book of Romans, where he says, I really want to do the right thing and the good thing. But as soon as I want to do the right thing and the good thing, I find that I'm actually doing the wrong thing and the bad thing. And the more I want to do the right thing, the more I do the wrong thing. And I have no idea how to get out of this. Well, I love how Paul kind of sums up the assistance that God gives us in verse 13 of Philippians 2. He says it this. He says, it is God that's at work in you. God's not waiting on you to figure this out, right? God's not waiting on you to show up and try hard enough and have enough power and to rightly orient your... He's not waiting on you to do this. It says that God is the one doing this in you. Once again, looking to the Message translation, Eugene Peterson says this way. He says that energy, the energy to change, is God's energy. It's an energy deep within you. God himself willing and working at what will give him the most pleasure. I kind of say it this way. Spiritual formation takes place when we allow the Holy Spirit to work in us by reorienting or realigning our power and our passions around his mission and his agenda rather than ours. Now, that's a mouthful, and it sounds kind of maybe a little complex, but let me give you an illustration to unpack this a little bit. One of the favorite things that we love to do as a family is we love doing breakfast together. And when I say breakfast, I don't mean, like cereal and milk. I mean, we do eggs. Sometimes we do bacon. We do toast. We do juice. milk. I mean, it's like we do a whole smorgasbord. We love it, right? It's great. And we love doing it together as a family. Well, the other day, my 4-year-old Judah came to me and he was like, Daddy, I want to help you make breakfast. I was like, great. So I put the bowl in front of him and I've got the tray of eggs next to him. And I was like, all right, buddy, you're just going to take the egg out and you're going to crack it and then you're going to put it into the bowl. So he picks up the egg and he kind of lightly taps it. And really, he didn't do anything. I mean, it maybe made a dent, but that really wasn't going to work. So I said, buddy, you got to do it a little bit harder. I probably should have been more specific because he proceeds to haul back and smash that egg on the side of a bowl. And egg goes everywhere. I mean, there's egg on him, there's egg on me, there's egg on the cat. I think the only place there wasn't egg was in the bowl, and in the bowl instead was egg shells. So we're like fishing out and kind of working through all the slimy stuff to get the shells out. And I was like, all right, let's try this again. And I take his hand and he picks up the egg, and holding his hand, I help him tap the side of the bowl to break open the egg and let the yolk fall down into the bowl, and we discard the shell. Now, we did this several times, just kind of working together, me kind of doing this through him and with him and for him to crack the eggs open and then to put them in the bowl, stir it up so we can make some scrambled eggs. Now, we're all sitting down to breakfast together, and just shortly after that, and Judah proceeds to announce to the whole table, hey guys, I made eggs. Now, did he make eggs? Well, I mean, sort of. I mean, he kind of had a hand in it, but he didn't really do it himself. I was doing it through him. I was doing it with him. And in some cases, I was doing it for him. This is the same way that spiritual formation takes place in our lives. It is God at work in us through our wants, through our desires, through our powers, through our passions to create change in us first that then has a ripple effect into the world around us. Now, if you think about power and passion, you have to have them in balance. If you have too much power and not rightly oriented passion, then you become argumentative, you become unwavering, unforgiving, aggressive, you're constantly frustrated, you're emotionally charged, incredibly sensitive, and really just rough with other people. But if you have passion but no power, then really what you've got is nothing. I mean, you've got a whole lot of desire, but no real power to see anything come about, and you will never see change happen in your life or in the life of others. You've got to have a balance of both. So here's what I want you to do this week. Hopefully you've been practicing what we call the examine. The examine is just a 4-step process of spiritual reflection and prayer and meditation. We talked about it a few weeks ago. Let me encourage you to go back and check that out if you don't remember or if you hadn't checked that out yet. But it has 4 steps to it, and I'm not going to dive into all of them, but the steps are to remember, review, recenter, and renew. Remembering that God's presence is with you, God's power is in you as you walk the way of Jesus. But secondly, to review. Think about the previous 24 hours of your life. Think about the way that maybe you have power, or maybe have withheld power. Maybe you've had passion, or maybe you have withheld passion in your life. Sometimes this is something as overt as not standing up for a social justice issue, maybe at your workplace or in your family. And sometimes it's as simple but maybe difficult as not offering or extending forgiveness and grace to that person that maybe treated you the way you didn't want to be treated, or maybe something of that nature, saying, hey, you know what? I forgive you even though you did this to me. But then I want you to think about the next 24 hours, right? After you reviewed the past 24 hours, recenter your mind and your heart on the presence of God and how He loves you regardless of where you are in this process. And then I want you to renew your mind, as Paul says, in thinking about the next 24 hours. What changes can you make to maybe have rightly oriented power and rightly oriented passion in your everyday life? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you, be gracious to you, and give you His peace as you walk the way of Jesus, balancing power and passion in your everyday life.
Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. so good to me. Before I breathe the breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, when I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Savior say, thy stream indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. He washed it white as snow. He washed it white as snow. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow.